With us today, we have Dr. Elisabeth Fondren, an assistant professor of journalism at St. John's University and author of various books and papers on propaganda, including one on the groundbreaking organization that helped inspire this project, the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, or the IPA, which operated from 1937 to 1942. Dr. Fondren, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So first, I want to start off by asking, what made you write about the IPA?
Yes. So I think with a lot of what academics do and scholars is, in a way, tumble from one idea to the next. And so my dissertation, which was on German propaganda in World War I, and kind of how these propagandists failed but tried to modernize their approaches, how this carried over into the interwar area and then World War II. That was kind of the foundation for, or that is the foundation for a lot of my work. And because I am based here in New York City, I stumbled upon the archives of the IPA at the New York Public Library. This was really during my first summer here in 2019. And I thought, well, let me look up if anybody had written about it, and nobody had. And many people, of course, have touched on the IPA. And so I decided to do a paper on the IPA's legacy and specifically how they tried to expose extremist and fascist thought in America and in American media leading up to World War II. And so, yeah, I became really interested in this idea of what about counter-propaganda? How can we, develop tools to not just counter, but also expose and analyze foreign propaganda, domestic propaganda. And so the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, they had done all that, but I wrote the paper to really shed light on that history.
So, what were some of the things that the IPA taught Americans in their newsletters? And could you share some of their examples?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, the first newsletter was published in the fall of 1937. I think it was just called Announcement. And in that newsletter, Miller, the director, published what is now called the 7 propaganda devices. I have to look up all of them. I always forget one of them. But a lot of communication scholars still use those devices to study, because in a way they're very catchy. And so this was kind of the first way of developing a typology. How can we think about all the different ways that, for example, Joseph Goebbels is using media strategically? Let me see if I can find them. Yes, so the analytical devices that we still use in political communication are name calling, glittering generalities, transfer, testimonial, plain folks, card stacking, and bandwagon. On top of that, that first issue had the long list of board of directors who, as I said, included many famous names, people who were studying propaganda and public opinion professionally. But then in my analysis of the newsletters, I found that they really tried to combine essays with analytical sections. For example, they would have an article that was called The ABCs of Propaganda. And again, we would have kind of a typology of all the things that make up propaganda. Later, they would publish packages that were called Decide for Yourself, which was really interesting because they included real examples of, for example, Goebbels and then Stalin's speeches translated into English, and tasked readers to, yes, take a pen and analyze, all the different devices. So generalities, bandwagon effect, card stacking, etc. And to me, that was so interesting because it would almost seem unthinkable now, or maybe not, to have, side by side a speech by, Roosevelt, Stalin, and then also Goebbels or Hitler, and then really task audiences to define that. Each month, of course, they would have a different theme. For example, they would look at newspapers. They would always make suggestions for the readers how to, as I said, become more skeptical, become more critical. For example, they would ask readers to expand their horizon and not just read one paper. They would say, you have to, in order to really know what's going on, have an understanding of public opinion, you need to read a national paper. You need to read a paper that has an opposing point of view or publishes op-eds from people that you don't agree with. You have to try to source news that look at international affairs and have commentaries. They had a very big issue, I think this was in 1941, on broadcasting and the effect of radio propaganda on audiences. So I think in terms of content, they really tried hard to diversify what they were looking at. But in my research, I find that in terms of style of presentations, a lot of their material had and really could not shake off this very instructional tone. It was as if you're sitting down really with a school book, and take time out of your day to complete these analysis sections. And only later in 1940 and 1941 did they actually introduce color. So up until that point, everything was black and white. We have very dense font. We have very few images. As I said, it looks very academic, very, intellectual, instructional. And they could never really, the IPA could not shake off that tone. I don't think they wanted to. I think they were actually appealing to an audience that was investing time and money, of course. This was a subscription-based newsletter that people had to pay for. I think it was $2 for 1 year subscription. And then also later they would contract work out to successful authors to publish books and really try to generate not just revenue for their work, but also interest, right? How can we popularize not just what we're doing, but how can we get schools on board? They had an educational director who actually worked with schools here in New York and Massachusetts, trying to implement these analytical workbooks in public schools. But the newsletters more or less looked the same throughout, 5 years. And just if now in hindsight, we look at it, just really can't compare with the visual appeal of, let's say, a poster or a radio show. I read in the archives that the IPA tried to create a radio show. Miller sometimes did go on and discussed his work. He, in a way, really, he worked really hard to popularize what they were doing. He would be speaker at events. I know he spoke at the World Fair in Queens in 1939, and he said, actually, we don't need less propaganda, we need more. And this is something that I can touch on a little bit later, because the IPA had a very interesting understanding of what they were doing, and they call themselves, we are propagandists for democracy. So they would say, yes, we are propagandists, but we're doing good propaganda. And this, of course, is what led on critics and people in government to say, no, what you are doing is something that is deeply un-American. You're making people become skeptical and cynical, and you're making them less patriotic at a time when we don't need people analyzing Goebbels' speech, right? We need them to become emotionally invested in the prospect of having to fight a war.
Could you detail the expansion and some of the successes that the IPA had during, the first few years?
Yeah, so I would say one of the successes definitely was the seven propaganda devices. The fact that we still use it today speaks volumes. The other very successful legacy or lesson that we can draw from the IPA's experience was that they were able to get journalists and experts endorse what they were doing. So in 1937, when they launched, and then throughout 1938, I found a number of very positive reviews and news articles that appeared in major publications, New York Times, Washington Post as well, but they were a little bit more critical. And so having this sort of endorsement or pitching your ideas in a way that amplifies what journalists are already doing, because journalists too are exposing propaganda, right, and helping people understand it. But the IPA was successful in really trying to make their point about why is this important, and why in the United States we don't censor the news, right? We don't try to counter it. We don't have one-sided points of view, as was the case in Nazi Germany, but we actually try to analyze opinions or facts that we don't agree with in a way that is more scientific, is more objective, and that definitely was something that was not original, but it was new in the way that it reached a mainstream or a larger audience, right? So to me, this idea that the IPA staff and then contributors call themselves propagandists for democracy was a way in which they appealed to really, we can say that all they were trying to do is facts, but this is a very emotional appeal, right? They say we're propagandists for democracy, and we can do this in the United States because we have the First Amendment. And this is another aspect that really was just fascinating, because they kept referring to the First Amendment in their articles, and they said, in the United States, we have the right to propagandize. So in other words, they were saying, yes, we understand why Nazi propagandists are here. We're not saying it's a good thing, but let us kind of come up to speed and share this intelligence and this understanding of what are they doing, why are they doing it. And so I think that was really great. At the same time, in the late 1930s in New York, we have mass rallies of the German American Bund, which was a Nazi, a homegrown U.S. Nazi organization. They were marching, and so those were kind of the groups that the IPA worked against. And let me just look at the figures. When they started out, they had mailed the newsletter to 3,000 people, schools, journalism programs, educators, journalists, and so on. In 1939, the newsletter had 7,000 subscribers, which was up from 5,000 subscribers the previous year. But even though those numbers, kept kind of climbing, we see that in 1941, there's kind of a turning point, because the HUAC committee, the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was, led by Representative Deese, threatened that it would investigate the IPA. And they made this announcement, but then didn't really follow through right away. And what we see is that, at that time, that people are starting to say, well, is the IPA, is this really constructive in, trying to advance American policy, or don't we have, or is skepticism and criticism of information, is this really the right way? Or should we not start really training ourselves in becoming kind of anti-Nazi propagandists? And this HUA committee, they threatened to investigate the IPA following a study that the IPA released that I think they said 3,000 schools were using their materials, and that kind of led the HUA committee to kind of to throw their hands up and say, okay, and now we're trying to get after you because what you're doing is actually not supporting our democratic ideas. It's actually has an adverse effect. Excuse me.
This was around what year? This is around 1940 when this started?
1941, yeah.
Yeah, 41, yeah.
Yes. I think though, when, and I would invite all of your listeners to really trying to, and I can share the article, I can also share the actual newsletters. They're publicly available. If you just Google, IPA propaganda analysis, this was the name. And just to look at one of those issues, it's really remarkable how much similarity there is to today's anxieties about not just propaganda, but also monopolies of news organizations. What is the role of foreign news, for example, in education? But my last point on what they did right was that they continued to gather, right, facts. They would commission not just books and trying to recruit contributors to the newsletter, but they would also gather reports. And one of their findings, which I think is really harrowing, was that in the December 1938 issue, they published a report that there were more than 800 groups in the US that were spreading anti-Semitic messages. So that just gives us this figure, 800 groups in 1938. Miller also, in his editorials, repeatedly warned Americans that there would be an increase of Nazi propaganda, which was designed to divide Americans, and then also justify the persecution of Jews, Catholics, and Protestants. And he wrote this in 1938, right? So they were really, in a way, ahead and very much in touch with what was happening politically, both domestically but also internationally, and really trying to point out the danger, as I said, that can, or the actual consequences that can happen from when language turns into action. So yeah.
Let's just talk about the end of the IPA, the end of its run. Why did it end, and what were some of the issues that it ran into? You touched upon them earlier, but that kind of hastened its demise.
Absolutely. So I would say number one was definitely funding, right? After Verleen died, his money was, if I'm not incorrect, his money was governed by a trust. It was called the Goodwill Fund. And there's communication between the IPA and them, but they say, after, we'll give you money up until early 1942, but then there is no more money. And at the same time, the IPA really, they had tried and gotten better, but they failed to really, appeal to a mainstream audience. They had never really aligned their newsletter with, let's say, a national newspaper, right? And so I would say funding definitely was one of the main reasons why the Institute faltered and failed, question mark. But of course, we also have to consider kind of the political and cultural context that directed much of what they were doing. So we can ask, right, if or let's put it this way, if had we had an IPA in the 1920s, or did it need kind of the rise of, Nazism, fascism in Europe and then worldwide to generate an interest to, in a way, arm American audiences? So in that regard, the historical context is I think it's really imperative to understand also the backlash that they received. In the IPA files, I found countless letters and insults against Millers, particularly. For example, people would write on the IPA newsletter, let's say business reply cards that were, actually intended for people to sign up for the newsletter. People would send it back and would say, warmongerer, or stand with FTR, or, what you're doing is lying. We see that kind of sentiment, but then also more institutionally, we have the HUAC involvement and trying to pin the IPA as this very leftist and anti-American organization. Miller was very, let's say, heated when he found out when he saw sensationalized language about what they were trying to do, the work that we're trying to do. For example, I think there's one newspaper article that called them propaganda foes or propaganda hunters. And then he would write back and say, no, this is not what we're trying to do. We're trying to build awareness and use education to appeal to a wider audience. That being said, I think that to my point earlier, we see that some of the things were actually successful. And provide us with a nice case study of what happens when, we have this very heightened awareness around national and nationalistic messages, when we have somebody actually pointing to the press's role and saying, you have an obligation to advance knowledge for average people. We have discussion of the First Amendment, saying, we in this country, we have the right to propagandize. Right? We don't really see those frames today. People don't call themselves propagandists, right? People don't say we're propagandizing for something good. And the IPA certainly did. And then my last point, we see that the national press served as, especially in the early years, as an amplifier for what the IPA was doing. And we see that how important that is to have not just, your own initiative, but to have this wider discourse that press and the agenda setting that they play a part in, that they can decide on what are we focusing on. And we see that that during this time when so much depended on countering fascist thought, that we actually have institutions and groups that were doing that, even though it was on a small scale, and even though it was criticized, it was there. And we should really look at what were they doing, and what are the ideas that have survived. And this idea of, I think that Alfred McClung Lee wrote in 1952, he said, we can stand on our own feet in our thinking and help others do the same. And to me, that really encapsulates so perfectly what this institute or what these people were trying to do, spreading awareness, but then also giving people kind of tools, real hands-on knowledge that they feel they can use in their daily lives.
Okay, it looks like we're out of time for today. We've been talking to Dr. Elisabeth Fondren, an assistant professor of journalism at St. John's University and author of the paper, We Are Propagandists for Democracy, the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, pioneering media literacy efforts to fight disinformation. Dr. Fondren, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, my pleasure.